My guest today is Dr. Shruti Rajagopalan, who's Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and a Fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute at NYU School of Law. Her area of interest is the economic analysis of comparative legal and political systems. Welcome, Shruti.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your papers from a recent paper from 2021, the 1991 reforms and the quest for economic freedom in India. You said that this paper studies the 1991 reforms as a beginning of the transition toward a market economy from the socialist policies implemented in the first 4 decades of the Indian Republic. Tracking the major reforms in the three decades since 1991, you say, I argue that economic control and statist policies are the norm, that reforms enhancing economic freedom are the outliers. Yeah, so having grown up in India, I can relate to this, Shruti, and it's sort of interesting in many different levels. So um, you talk about the sort of the pre 1990s state of India. So we probably want to start in the 1940s and sort of take our time to the 1990s. Something really dramatic happened in the 1990s in India, and I was watching it from the U.S. Um, Not in detail, but at least on the surface, things appear to be changing quite rapidly. So let's go back to 1940s. I mean, India got the independence in 1947. We had a group of leaders. I sometimes think of this as Britain sort of held India back for about 200 years. They probably held India back more because they educated the leaders who sort of started India in the 1947. And so let's go back to that time and what do we see there?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great broad question, and I think you're starting at the right point. So, in the 1940s is when India gets its first real, brush with extensive economic controls. And at that point, they're a combination of a couple of factors. One immediate factor is World War II, right? So during wars, there's always some kind of war rationing, right? And then, suddenly prices shoot up. So you start getting price controls and quantity controls. And India was no different. It was a part of the colonial empire. A lot of the resources were getting drafted towards the war effort. So India saw this kind of like extensive controls come in, like whether it is currency controls, whether it is quantity controls for various kinds of inputs, price controls for essential commodities. This is sort of the time during that period. Along the same time, there is an independence movement which is brewing. And as you rightly mentioned, the nationalist leaders who sort of took over Indian governance from the colonial empire, they were mostly British educated Indian elites. A lot of them were lawyers by training, or they had studied at Oxford and Cambridge and the LSE. A number of national leaders were particularly inspired by the Fabian movement, right? And when I say the Fabian movement, there are two parts to it. One is, of course, the intellectuals. This is George Bernard Shaw. This is Harold Lasky. This is Sidney and Beatrice Webb. But there's also the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, which is becoming more prominent at that time. And the British Labour Party really supports, a move towards greater Indian freedom in a way that other political parties in Britain at the time did not. Right. So it's an interesting combination of factors that is taking place at the time. It's political, it's intellectual. These leaders take over from the colonial state in 1947. And Nehru is, of course, most famously known for being Fabian socialist, right? The folklore is Nehru is hugely inspired by Harold Lasky and George Bernard Shaw, but it's not just Nehru, right? His right-hand man, Trilok Singh, is very instrumental in drafting the first 5-year plan. and a socialist, right? PC Mahalanobis, who is a very important physicist turned statistician, implements the second 5-year plan. Whether it is Pitambar Pant, like so many of the people surrounding Nehru at that time, within the bureaucracy, within the governance system, they're all Fabian. In the 30s, the Indian National Congress Party also sets up what is called the socialist wing. They start looking at how they can make development plans. That is, their model for India's development post independence is very much an economic planning scheme, right? And a lot of these plans are inspired by the socialist system, and a lot of them are also inspired by the Fabian idea. India, of course, eventually turns into a constitutional democracy, right? So the Fabian model is much more pertinent relative to the Soviet model. So this is where it all begins. In the 1950s, India has a continuation of the war controls, but it also implements a number of policies which are socialist. And the idea is that India will gradually move towards greater and greater equality and greater government control over resources, because that's sort of the plan, right? So India starts with a mixed economy. There are certain sectors which are only reserved for the government. There are commodities which are marked as essential commodities, which is an extension of war controls, but more things are added to it. A lot of the factors of production, this is your land, labor, financial capital, all of these are brought under extensive government regulation.
Mm.
And by the time you have the second and third 5-year plan, you very much have a Soviet style planned economy. Not a 100% planned economy because it's still a mixed economy, but the government is essentially got a plan on how many bicycles need to be produced, for instance, in the economy, right?
It's
Or
it's
how
not
many.
it's not bread and butter, but it's bicycles and rickshaws in this case.
Exactly. And now when you think about the Indian system, the mixed economy was very much controlling the means of production, right? Like you said, it's not end use, apples, oranges, bread and butter. That has a much more thriving private market for it. But if you're controlling how much iron and steel, that needs to be produced in the economy, and it's completely under the government sector, and you are relatively a closed economy. That's the other part, right? This is the hangover or the baggage from the East India Company and the extractive mercantilist policies of the British crown. You decide that you're going to be a very closed, inward looking economy, right? I have to add at this point that this was also the sort of a mainstream prescription for developing economies at that time,
Mm.
right? It's not like modern day economics where the growth prescription is very much free trade and property rights and strong institutions and sound governance. At that time, the idea was that this kind of deeply intertwined free trade, global free trade model, that's great for developed economies, but developing economies need to be protected,
Mm.
right? Their industries, their sectors need to be protected, which means you need to have a relatively closed economic model. You need to have very high tariffs, so that you can protect the domestic industry. So this is what's going on in India. So I'll give you a
Yes.
simple example. Sorry.
Yeah. No, so you talk about Nehru and sort of the first Indian leaders sort of getting enamored by Oxford ideas in the 1940s, and they come to India and they try to implement those ideas. And overlapping with this, which I find is quite interesting, I never thought about this, is this idea that during the war, there were a lot of controls, and then India becomes independent, and you have sort of a status quo maintenance problem
Yeah.
for, for a short period of time. And the status quo maintenance is really driven by controls, right? So that is sort of how we got here.
Yeah, and so unfortunately, that's not where we stayed. It just got progressively worse, right? And some of it getting progressively worse is actually it's the nature of socialist planning. Each intervention demands a further intervention. So let's say that the prescription at that time was that the government must control iron and steel. And the idea was that, iron and steel is very much a high financial capital investment kind of sector. Private industries are not going to be able to do it. They're not going to be able to achieve scale. So let's reserve this for the government, and the government's going to do this. And if you don't allow imports and you're a closed economy, now resources are scarce, right? So if the government's figuring out iron and steel, it actually needs to figure out what kind of iron and steel requirements are there in the rest of the economy if it's running a planned economy.
Mm.
So this becomes very complicated very quickly, right? So for instance, the kind of steel we need to produce for bicycles is quite different from the kind of steel we need to produce for, say, my glasses, right?
Yeah.
So now, if you want to correctly allot, you need to know what is the priority of bicycles vis-a-vis the priority of glasses in an economy.
Mm.
How many bicycles do we need, right? And then we can appropriately produce these goods, which means now you need to target the number of bicycles produced in the economy, right? And how do you target the number of bicycles produced in the economy? You need to fix the number in advance. It can't be determined by the market, right? And if you fix the number in advance, you don't want people hoarding bicycles, which means you're going to have a permit system of who is allowed to have a bicycle. So you have bicycle permits, right? So this is the nature of a socialist economy, right? I have a really wonderful example here. These are, the Bajaj Chetak scooters,
Oh,
which
yeah.
used to be, it looks like a Vespa, basically. It's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Indian version of a Vespa. At one point, they even collaborated. It was called a
They're good
Bajaj
scooters.
Vespa.
Yeah.
They were excellent scooters and kind of the mainstay for the middle class Indian man or the middle class Indian small family, right?
Yeah.
And the trouble was they became incredibly popular, right? But because you have a target allotment for iron and steel, you also have a target number for how many scooters can be produced in the economy, right?
Mm.
So Rahul Bajaj, who was, the owner of the Bajaj sort of industries, he at one point kept going back to the Ministry of Commerce in India and said, look, the quantity demanded is far higher than the quantity we're able to supply.
Mm.
But you can't increase the quantity produced. You need an expansion permit. You need a special iron and steel permit. You need a coal permit. If you want to import certain parts, you need a foreign exchange permit. So he'd keep going back for these permits and they didn't give him the permit, right? Now, in a world where Bajaj scooters are extremely popular, right, but you're not allowed to increase supply, the price of Bajaj scooter is going to skyrocket.
Yeah.
But in a socialist economy, how can we allow Rahul Bajaj to profit from our iron and steel and socialist 5-year plan policy? So now what happens? Now you're going to have price controls in addition to the quantity controls on a Bajaj scooter, and you're going to have profit margin controls. So the government will tell you how many scooters you can produce, what price you sell them at, and what is the maximum profit range that you can make off of these scooters, right?
Mm.
Now, the market is the market, right? It cannot be controlled. You can just drive it underground. So what ended up happening was the wait list grew very long for a Bajaj scooter. And at one point, the price of a second-hand Bajaj scooter available immediately was about 3 times higher than a brand new Bajaj scooter, but that would only be available 6 years from now, right?
Yeah, so this is a slippery slope of planned economies, and
Yeah.
we do this. We have seen this in many, many instances before. We appear to continue to do this. And what the planners don't understand is that they don't have all the information to
Yes.
optimize the problem. However smart they are, they think they are. There's sort of uncertainty in the information, and the optimization is a dynamic problem.
Yeah.
So we have proven that mathematically, but then India sort of continues on that path, right, from the 1950s.
It's a little unfortunate. So what you say is absolutely right. Mises and Hayek famously they were part of what was called the calculation debate, right? And the socialists on the other side were Oscar Lange and Abba Lerner. And this debate, famously, now we know that Mises and Hayek won, right? And their argument was quite simple. It's exactly what you're saying. It is that this simply cannot be done. It was called the impossibility of socialist calculation. You simply cannot calculate when you don't have prices reflecting the relative scarcity of goods, and you can't make profit and loss calculations, right? So you're right. This debate took place well before 1950. But the orthodoxy was still promoting socialist ideas for a long time.
mm,
I'll give you a personal example. I studied in India in college, Delhi University in the early 2000s. And when I was studying comparative economic systems, I didn't know that the socialist calculation debate was a debate.
mm.
I only studied Oscar Lange and Abba Lerner. I never studied Mises and Hayek. I studied Mises and Hayek for the first time when I came to the United States to do my PhD, part of which was on Indian socialism. And of course, George Mason University is famous for its big influence in Austrian economics and history of economic thought.
Yeah.
And that's the first time I read it. So I think there is a lag in how some of these ideas enter the mainstream.
Mm,
And often the orthodoxy may persist a lot longer, right? But on the other hand, a lot of the global events also impacted how India slowly got weaned off of socialism. And, one of them is the rise of the Asian tigers, South Korea
mm.
and Taiwan and all these countries, Malaysia, just opening up to trade and just doing fantastically well. And while South Korea opened up in the 60s, the conversation still was very much that, South Korea is a small country. They can do this. But for India and China, which are these huge countries with massive development problems, it must be state led.
Mm.
It's only when China liberalized, it started liberalizing in 1978. And by the late 80s, you could tell the big difference that India was like, oh, even the Chinese have liberalized. So the prime minister of the day,
Yeah.
PV Narasimha Rao, was hugely inspired by Deng Xiaoping and even
Mm.
went to China with the hope of meeting him. I don't think they had a one-on-one meeting, but
Oh, wow.
the government of that time, Rajiv Gandhi was also watching what was being done by Deng Xiaoping's government in terms of reforms quite carefully. And this was just before the PV Narasimha Rao government. So it's true that the orthodoxy takes a long time to change, but sometimes some global events can also have a very quick timeline in how they impact other countries.
But the information existed. I spent some time at University of Chicago, so my bias is very much in that vein. But the information existed about sort of free market, free trade ideas for a long time. But in some countries like India, there was this idea of strategic policy, so that we need to protect industries so that we can become self
Yeah,
sufficient, those types of ideas, right? So
yeah.
all those ideas have been proven wrong for quite a bit of time, but then India sort of went on with the same antiquated ideas for a long time, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes history casts a really long shadow. I was recently reading this wonderful book by Tirthankar Roy and Anand Swami, and they've talked about how, colonial laws, a lot of them still have a huge impact on how we think about land relationships and land transactions today, right? How we think about women's property rights or adoption rights today. And this is a colonial legacy that doesn't go back 50 years, it goes back 150 years, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes I think a lot of the laws and institutions, they can survive a lot longer, and there might be some resistance to change. And when the change happens, sometimes it can happen suddenly and sometimes it takes time. So even post liberalization, like, during liberalization, we managed to knock off a lot of the closed economy, crazy high import tariffs and protectionism. That came down fairly quickly. We managed to knock off a lot of this industrial policy, in terms of licensing regimes, the sort of licensing we imposed on, say, Bajaj scooters. We managed to dismantle that almost overnight. But we have not, even 30 years after liberalization, we have not done a good job of having a modern day labor capital relationship
Mm.
which can be enforced through contract, right? So free markets must stand on the foundation of consent and contract, for
Yeah.
which you need a functional judicial system, you need sensible legislation on how labor and capital interacts and contracts. 30 years post liberalization, we are nowhere close to,
Mm.
you know, re reforming or rethinking that relationship. So in some ways there has been a quick success. In some ways, India is still very much in the socialist mindset. And if you speak with people like Anand Swami, they'll say, oh, it's not just socialism. The labor capital relationship, I can trace it back to 1850, to the colonial regime. So I think this just needs more study, and it
Mm,
needs more careful study in the local Indian context. We
mm.
literally need to go through, one legislation at a time, one executive rule at a time, and start thinking about, is this compatible with the kind of globalized modern day economy that India wishes to build, or does this need to be reformed and changed in some sensible fashion?
Yeah, so let me ask you this, Shruti. Um, so one of the issues that India had, I would argue, I'm just arguing this. I don't really have strong feelings, but intellectual property protection and property rights are foundational attributes of a free market economy. If you want to develop, to become a developed economy, um, India has had some problems in the intellectual property arena, especially in pharmaceuticals and those types of things. And so this is sort of a strategic question. There is no tactical path to development, I would argue. You have to get all the boxes checked. I mean, it's not like, there is no freedom at midnight. You got to get all
Absolutely.
the boxes checked to become a developed economy. And it doesn't appear that India never really committed to that.
Yeah, and I think the commitment is at multiple levels, right? So one is there needs to be an intellectual commitment, right? So the scholars who are working on this, whether it is, scholars within social sciences and economics, or whether it is history, or whether it is in science and policy, in the case of intellectual property and things like that, there needs to be a commitment that this is the nature of, the economy one wishes to run. And are the policies we are suggesting, or are the plans we are making, compatible with that, right? So I think in one sense India has still got this huge socialist hangover, right?
Mm.
Most of the Indian intellectuals still lean left,
Yeah.
even though they enjoy right, they're very much enjoying the
Yeah.
gains and the benefits of a liberalized economy, but on a specific issue they might always be, more towards the left, simply because that's how we were educated, right? and
Right.
and so that is now very, very slowly changing. So that's, yeah, I think one. I think the second is the commitment from the political side, right? I think this is just the gaping hole, right? Every political class comes in and says that they want to have some kind of reform. But to have this kind of reform, we need to build a pipeline. Whether it's intellectuals, scholars, technocrats, bureaucrats, you need to build this pipeline that has nothing to do with the politics of the current day.
Mm.
So if we go back to the 1991 moment, for, just to give you an example, uh, a lot of the people who worked in the PV Narasimha Rao government were also there during the VP Singh government, the technocrats. Some
Yeah.
of them were also there during the Rajiv Gandhi government, a few years before
Yeah.
that, right? Or Chandrasekhar government, which was the short interim government. Now, these four leaders are quite different. They had quite different agendas. They had very different constituencies that were
Mm.
supporting them. Their governments had different strengths and weaknesses. But the people who formed the scaffolding, to get the reforms through, they have this continuity across these four
Mm.
governments, right?
Mm.
And I'm talking about, like, some of the pioneers who helped India reform, right? This is like Montek Singh Ahluwalia, this is Rakesh Mohan, Rangarajan, C. Rangarajan, who was at the time at the RBI, A.N. Verma, who was in the Prime Minister's office. These are really important people who took on very important specific parts of the portfolio. And in our 1991 project, we've listed about 20 of them. But you saw this huge continuity,
Mm.
right? I see that as completely disappearing in modern day politics.
Yeah.
Now what happens is that if you have a particular chief minister or prime minister from a particular caste or a particular region, they'll say, oh, I want all the people surrounding the prime minister's office to now be Gujarat cadre, because our current prime minister is from Gujarat, right? Or if the current RBI governor is from Odisha, then we need to have officers from Odisha. So it's gone back to being very parochial.
Yeah.
And if you change the technocrats and bureaucrats and intellectuals and scholars, like, the changing winds of the day, you're not going to get very sensible reform. For sensible reform, we need a bunch of people working on these ideas for a long time with an intellectual commitment, so that when the political class finds an opening, right, when that Overton window shifts, you can pass those reforms. That's what we saw in 1991.
Yeah, so there are two things here, Shruti. One is sort of, do I like these people? You know, so when administration changes, you sort of flesh out the current group of people and replace them with something else. But then there's a competence question.
Yeah.
So this continuity that you talk about across four different administrations actually might have helped India at that time. I remember, my teacher from Chicago, Raghuram Rajan, was RBI governor for a
Yeah.
while, and then when the current administration came in, they said he's not Indian enough. He has to get out. So we make ad hoc policy decisions
Yeah.
based on some sort of pride or something that I don't quite understand. But optimality of outcomes is not
Yes.
what politicians really seek for, right?
Absolutely. And this is a new thing in India, I must say. I'm sure there was a lot of favoritism and nepotism and cronyism within the bureaucracy and technocracy, even during Nehru's time or Indira Gandhi's time. But this, visceral, this is our guy, this is not our guy. This kind of labeling which is happening in modern day India, I don't think this was happening even 15, 17 years ago.
Mm,
Uh, so, for instance, I have spoken to technocrats who served in the Ministry of Finance, not that long ago, 15, 17 years ago. And you speak with them and they say, look, of course, you don't want to go on every television show and go crazy and attack the prime minister. But we were free to write opinion editorials saying we don't agree with the policy of the day. And when we wrote those kinds of, opinion editorials, the finance secretary would give us a call and say, why don't you come and have lunch with me? Why don't you tell me what your problem is and we can flesh it out, and we will take your input into account, right? So there was a just a greater amount of trust in elites and intellectuals, especially the technocratic class. uh, that trust has gone missing. Now it's
mm,
very much, as we saw in the case of, Dr. Agram Rajan, it's very much, are you with us or against us, right?
mm,
There's no midway. And there's no sense that you can be with the national interest but arguing against a particular government policy or a particular person in power,
mm,
right? So this is really something that's changed in India. I think it's very unfortunate. I think a second problem, and I mean, this is not just about Dr. Rajan, but I think about a lot of the recent technocratic hires. Uh, there is a new feeling in India that these are people who really don't have much to do with India.
mm.
They're kind of helicoptered in for a 3-year
Yeah.
term. They don't plan to stay, and then they will go back to their jobs, right? And I've seen a number of people, and these are some of the best minds. I mean, I've heard people say this about, Arvind Panagaria, who's at Columbia, who served as the heading the Niti Aayog. I've heard this said about, Kaushik Basu, who's at Cornell, who was a former chief economic advisor, about Raghuram Rajan, about, Viral Acharya, who was again at the RBI. These are some of the smartest minds we have, but they have these jobs. So the sense is very much they are not doing this to be in it.
Mm,
Right. So they're just coming in for a short period of time. They're doing this as a stint and they'll go back to their academic careers. This is another major difference, relative to 30 years ago, when a lot of the foreign trained technocrats came to India to serve in government. They actually stayed for a long time.
mm,
They had 7, 8, 10, 15-year tenure. So this is, for instance, C. Rangarajan. was trained at University of Pennsylvania, were taught at NYU, but sort of moved, right? Vijay Kelkar. All these people, you can very much see that the tenure is longer and more continuous. So I think it is a combination of personality. It's a
Yeah.
combination of current social media politics and whatever is your news channel politics. It's a combination of the length of tenure and a sense that these people are not really Indians living in India. So it's a lot of factors, but it's very unfortunate.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate because expertise come from all places.
Exactly.
And the success of the US is part of that. We don't say somebody coming from Ukraine or Colombia. Well, they're from Ukraine. I mean, if you bring something to the table,
Yeah.
then we accept them, right, as something interesting. But India doesn't do that. So India has had this is sort of something that sort of holds back India, I think, in the long run. What I call sort of a false pride, which is I keep hearing, this is an ancient country, we have figured everything out. I don't see India has figured anything out actually in the grand scheme of things. It might have an ancient country, but it hasn't figured anything out. It has a lot to learn from other countries, I think.
I mean, I completely agree with you that this sort of outsider bias and this outsized way is completely counterproductive. But I think it has a lot to do with day-to-day interactions also. I think the way American academics approach anything is quite different, right? We have a very American sensibility, and I'm including myself in this. If I've lived and worked in the United States for the last 15 years, I came here to start graduate school, but I just sort of stayed on. And the way I think about hierarchies, the way I interact with other people, the way I treat people in a particular bureaucracy, it's very different than
Mm,
how the Indian bureaucracy functions,
mm,
right? And when you're an outsider to that, I think there's also a lot of day-to-day confusion. And I mean, not confusion in the sense of like some kind of comedy going on. I mean confusion in the sense of trust building exercise, right?
mm.
All of bureaucracy or technocracy making big decisions, especially reform decisions, they are founded on networks and trust.
Yeah.
So if I don't like having tea with you, or the way you conduct yourself during lunch is completely different from the way we do things in India, right? Uh, and if that doesn't gel, then how
Mm,
can I trust you when I'm making a major decision about, inflation policy or interest rate policy? And I mean, this seems like a bizarre thing. You're right. We must overcome these biases and these issues. They seem so minor, but it is difficult in real
it is,
life.
yeah, it is
Uh,
difficult. Yeah.
to have a deep level of trust with people simply based on expertise where there isn't a deep personal connection. So I do think that the length of tenure matters for many reasons. I think
Mm,
people who are coming in from outside, there is some learning to be done on how the Indian technocracy works. How do we fit ourselves well in it? How do we make sure that we function as part of that whole without disturbing the whole or without criticizing everything,
mm.
and just criticizing the specific policy at hand. So I think I think both sides have a lot of learning to do, but it's
Yeah.
fundamentally a question of mismatched expectation and mismatched working style. And I think just saying that someone is an expert and has written wonderful papers on this or op-eds on it, I don't think it is going to overcome the kind of the very static system that operates in India, and it's been running like that forever, and it's going to run like that forever. And in India, the markers for trust are caste and community and language, right?
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
moment you can't rely on other networks, professional networks, you kind of slide back to that, which is why we have this whole, are you a BJP wala or a Congress wala, right? Or are you,
Yeah.
from my state or my caste? So it feels very parochial, but I think more than being parochial, it's the way out when there aren't other good ways of forming professional trust and commitment to an intellectual cause.
Yeah, I agree with you. So it goes both ways. Western societies have to figure out Eastern societies. It's not just India, it's all Eastern cultures or even South American cultures.
Yeah.
Um, where you go in with a set of expectations based on your experience and heuristics, and doesn't quite work. It doesn't quite work that way. And so you have to readjust, retune. So I want to finish up on this paper. So this idea that you say here, after independence and never fully committed to the pursuit of economic freedom, after the initial set of reforms in the 1990s and 2000s, we sort of hit um, a dead end, so to speak. So my my grandfather and my wife's grandfather were colleagues in the first Kerala assembly after independence. And I grew up, sort of sitting against him, and he had always had BBC on, and so that's sort of my my experience. And there was a time, I believe, in India where people were genuinely interested, from a political perspective, to make the country better. It is unclear to me in 2022 it is the same anymore.
I'm not sure I entirely agree. At least the people I speak with, and I'm, talking about everyone, whether it's, when I go to India, I'm talking about Uber drivers who are taking me around, right? Or when I go to the market and I talk to some shopkeepers, I'm an economist, so I like talking about what's going on in the marketplace. Or I'm talking about like high level meetings I might have, with various bureaucrats in India. I see a very strong commitment to the national interest,
Mm,
very much so.
yeah.
I At least I have felt that. I have, never come out of an interaction or a meeting thinking, oh my God, this guy is just for himself, and, or
Mm,
this lady is just for herself, and they don't care what's happening to the country. But I think the way they look at the world is
mm,
quite different, right?
mm,
So I'll tell you what I think is the fundamental difference between, say, the way you and I think, and and some of the thinking in India. You are a Chicago trained guy, right? So I can include you in my grouping in this particular instance. But you and I don't think of market interactions as anything except a positive sum game,
mm,
right? So when we think about people transacting on their own, even if it's an unequal transaction, right? Even if I am engaging with a big monopolist, right? Or I'm engaging with the duopolist like Apple and Samsung, and it's a very expensive phone, we still know that this is a positive sum game. I'm gaining something from buying this very expensive Apple phone, and Apple is of course adding to its bottom line, and so on and so forth. A lot of people in India view market transactions as a zero sum game or a negative sum game.
mm,
And once again, this goes back to socialism and colonialism,
mm,
right? In colonialism, this was treated, I mean, it was talked about as a sort of market economy, but it was really an extractive mercantilist economy. It's an imperial power extracting resources for its own benefit, right? So it's not that the positive sum nature disappeared. Under socialism, anytime you saw markets, they were basically black markets, right?
mm.
So when there is a shortage of Bajaj scooters and there is this big line in the secondhand market, you're basically talking about crooks, who are trying to extract a huge premium from you for delivering a Bajaj scooter. And you know that the, maximum retail price or whatever the government has announced is 100 rupees. And this guy is selling it at 170 rupees. And you have no choice but to engage.
Right.
And so it feels very extractive. So I think a lot of the historical distortion of markets in India have
Mm,
led Indians to believe, or at least the hangover suggests, that market transactions are not positive sum games,
mm,
right? And I think this is the reason for a lot of market skepticism. So
mm,
the way they may approach the national interest and the way I may approach the national interest is quite different. So during COVID,
yeah.
I spoke with so many people and I told them, we must not put price controls. Let's say some labs make a killing, okay, during COVID tests, doesn't matter. Making a killing is a price signal, and the increase in price is going to encourage more suppliers to come in, so they will expand the lab capacity and it will adjust. It won't go on forever. But at that time, for a bureaucrat who is seeing this like massive death and devastation going on around them, the idea that a private lab is going to charge, 5,000 rupees for a COVID RT-PCR test when it should be 800 rupees, it just does not sit well with them.
Mm.
Right, they think this is just a huge kind of capitalist distortion, or people
Yeah.
extracting their pound of flesh. So I think this is where we get a lot of bad policies, because the larger market process is misunderstood and we don't think of it as a positive sum exchange.
Yeah, that's a great insight. So the way I think about this, Shruti, if I understand this, is that you're preconditioned to believe certain things. And those preconditions are based on your experiences. So if you haven't experienced free market capitalism, free trade, and the benefits come from those things, and you have only experienced, sort of a halfway house, so to speak, and there are a lot of problems, and you say, keep track of all the problems, and it doesn't look like if you go any further from the halfway house, it's going to be any better. So we have this sort of a longitudinal problem. So this is what I want to ask you. So Nehru and others came in 1947, set up a socialist democracy, quote unquote. I'm not sure it's a democracy anymore, but socialist democracy. And that's all you know. That's all the experiences that you have. That's all the data that you have. And and so how do we actually, sort of take this country to a free market capitalism and a free trade? I mean, 1990s, Manmohan Singh and others went from, a really bad situation to something better. But we could really take it all the way to some sort of a free market capital system, right?
Yeah, I think we just have to persuade minds. And I have a very strong commitment to that. I know a lot of people have suggested that it's so much easier to conduct reforms in dictatorships, relative to democracies. You hear so much of this, right? Given the Chinese experience, given the early South Korean experience, I have a very strong commitment to liberalism, whether it is political, whether it is constitutional, whether it's economic. And so I do think we just need to persuade people. So the 1991 project, that we have at Mercatus is very much an effort towards that. And we want to show, example after example, right? Paper after paper, essay after essay, that look, we need to think about reforms that grow the size of the pie, right? And don't just haggle over how we redistribute the pie, because that's a negative sum, rent seeking exercise. So we need to think about market transactions and how they grow the size of the pie, and how Indians can move towards that, and how Indians can prosper. I think we do need to be cognizant, as in the 80s and 90s, the sort of like what was dubbed the neoliberal prescription, for the whole country. This was the Washington Consensus and so on. It paid very little attention to who got the gains that were generated, as long as the gains were generated.
Mm.
And I think the one major difference is in 2022, we can't be agnostic like that. I still won't say we need a redistribution economy as opposed to a growth economy. India still needs to grow. It needs to, go to 10x its current GDP per capita. But we do need to think about who are the winners and losers in this transaction,
Mm.
right? How we are thinking about some basic safety nets. How are we thinking about access to markets, right? So we say, yeah, we're going to liberalize, but does the average person actually have access to these liberalized markets? Or are they in the informal economy, for instance, right? Selling their labor. Can they actually sell their land and exit agriculture in a sensible fashion and go set up another business? Or they are stuck in their caste ordained profession forever and ever? So I think we do need to think about these aspects more, in a way that nobody thought we need to think about them, in the 1980s and 90s. And as long as you
Yeah.
drop tariffs, and as long as you open up the economy, everything will be fine. So I do think that needs to change.
Yeah, so that's a truly practical question. So given set of initial conditions for country X, how do you take the country X to a better X prime position? It depends very much on the initial conditions. So
Yeah.
you could have theoretical arguments around free market capitalism and all of that, but the optimum solution depends on where you are and how you go from point X to point Y, right?
Yeah. And you go from point X to point Y by sharing the gains in a sensible
Yeah,
manner, right? If the gains from trade are so big, then, maybe one model is, a lot of people like, for instance, Jagdish Bhagwati and Arvind Panagaria had a wonderful book on why growth matters. And a very fundamental argument they make is, look, even for redistribution, you need more growth, right?
yeah,
Post liberalization, even though the footprint of state control reduced, state revenues increased 28 fold in nominal terms, right? Now, if you have 28x the revenues that you used to make previously, you can do so much more in terms of welfare, right? You can do
yeah.
so much more in terms of health, education, whether it's, universal basic income or farmer subsidies. So I do think we need to think about what the surplus is and how do we share the surplus. That's one. But I also think we need to find a very sensible and systematic way of persuading people about these benefits. A lot of the current discourse, unlike your podcast, is about the news of the day,
Hmm.
right? Or what is the scandal that week, right?
Right.
And all the discussion is basically noise surrounding a specific idea, which becomes old news in 15 days. Uh, we don't have deep dialogue and discourse on very important questions, right? How do we think about agriculture in India? How do we think about labor relationships in India, right? How do we think about inflation in India? Right, inflation is in double digits in the last month's reports that have
Hmm.
just come out. It's extraordinary. I mean, inflation is this massive tax on poor people. So you
Yeah.
do need inflation policy at the highest level, which Dr. Rajan incidentally set up,
Yeah.
the monetary policy committee and things like that. But you also need a very pragmatic everyday discourse, which I think is missing. So it's a persuasion exercise, according to me. I don't think we can ram this down anyone's throats without it.
I totally agree. So I want to go to another paper that you have, which is very topical, battling COVID-19 with dysfunctional federalism, lessons from India. And this was very intuitive for me, Shruti. I've been arguing for this for a long time with my IIT classmates, and there are differing opinions on this, but I feel very strongly. So what you say here, the Indian Federation is highly centripetal, you say here. And historically, this has left states without the requisite legislative and fiscal authority to make independent action and initiate policies of significance. Consequently, India's response to the global COVID-19 pandemic was to impose a very severe countrywide lockdown using the mandate of the union government. So this centralized one-size-fits-all idea, you say, was imposed despite high variations across states and resources, healthcare capacity, and incidence of COVID-19 cases. Um, yeah, so this is really intuitive for me. So, I'm looking at this data and I keep thinking this is not the right way to do things. As you say in this paper, we have 28 different states, 8 different union territories. We have 3 major religions. I don't know if you talk about that in the paper or not. Um, and every state has a different language, different culture, different food, different everything. And so India is like Europe put into one country. And so if the European Union sort of went out and imposed some sort of Europe-wide lockdown, it might not have been a good policy, right? What we find in India.
No, I mean, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I think it's a great summary of what we were trying to do in this paper. This is written with my colleagues GP Manish and Abhishek Chautagunta. And When Abhishek and I first started looking in a different paper, we were looking at healthcare capacity. And I just want to explain how we got to this idea in the first place. Very early on in COVID, there was this big thing about flattening the curve, right? And to flatten the curve, there are two sides to the equation, right? So one is, of course, how quickly the number of COVID cases are growing. But the other side of the equation is what is your healthcare capacity, right?
Hmm.
So Abhishek and I said, what is the healthcare capacity? Let's look into it. And, healthcare is a state and a union subject in India. So both the state governments and the federal government are allowed to legislate and allowed to make investments. And what we found is would not surprise any Indian and most people coming from federal countries, which is that there is massive variation. So I mean, there's massive variation in Indian states. You have Indian states like Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state, which is almost the size of Brazil, right? And then you have small states like Sikkim, which are the size of Bhutan. So that is one major difference. You have states which have very high GDP, which are like middle to high income country kind of GDP, like Goa has the same GDP per capita as Jordan, right? And the poorer states in India, like Bihar, are like Haiti, which is one of the poorest regions in the world. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when we think about India, right? It's 1.3 billion. It is a subcontinent with massive amount of regional variation. And even within these states, there are rich parts in the urban areas. There is a very poor countryside sometimes. So, even all of Uttar Pradesh is not equally poor, right? So it's got very important metropolitan centers, and then it has a countryside which can be relatively poor. So this is important to keep in mind. So when we started looking at healthcare capacity, we were not surprised that it is completely different in each state. And now, if we apply the simple logic of COVID and flattening the curve, if one side of the equation, which is healthcare capacity, is so different in each state, then the other side of the equation, which is the number of cases and how they rise and how that must be dealt with, must also be different, right? So it's possible to have a state where you don't have numbers going up very quickly, like Sikkim,
Hmm.
right? Which is relatively rich in terms of GDP per capita and doesn't have terrible hospital infrastructure. On the other hand, you can have a very rich state like Maharashtra where the numbers are just going crazy, right? This is
Hmm.
exponential growth doubling every 3 days, where you need to have a completely different kind of policy. What we saw in India was that that was not done, right? There was this massive knee jerk reaction, and there was a countrywide lockdown. The first lockdown, which was announced for 3 weeks and then extended to 70 days, it shut down a country of 1.3 billion people, effectively locked them in their homes, and brought economic activity to a staggering halt in a way that is not clear was beneficial.
Right.
Because there were states like Sikkim, there were some states in the Northeast which didn't even have one COVID case, you know, and had the same lockdown that you imposed in Maharashtra or Kerala, which had thousands of COVID cases. So this was our point. Now, if we peel the layers and we say, why did this happen in India? And, how crazy is this? It goes back to the nature of the federation, right? Uh, whether it is going back to colonial times where a small group of bureaucrats, a few hundred bureaucrats, were controlling the entire country effectively, right? Because you were running it for a group of people in Whitehall. Or you talk about post independent India and this planning exercise, right, where effectively you have the central government which controls most of the revenue, and it'll hand it out or distribute it to various states, and it controls all the economic activity and economic control in its hands. What you essentially have is you never have development of state capacity in each state,
Hmm.
right? And if you don't have a deep strong state in every state, and then I would even make this argument further for local government, if you don't have that, then the states in times of crisis are just kind of floundering. And even the states look to the prime minister's office and say, hey, you got to help us. You got to help us do something. Right. So the nature of Indian federalism is what leads to these kinds of lockdowns. And if you have these kinds of lockdowns, you're more likely to have them in the future because you never allowed every state to develop its own capacity. So that's kind of the short version of the argument. The longer version of the argument, and people are free to read the paper. The Southern Economic Journal very kindly made it open access because it was one of the COVID papers. So I think it's still freely available. The longer version of the paper actually goes through the detailed data. And I'm talking about what is the healthcare capacity of each state. We try and quantify it given the limited data that's out there. And we actually looked at very early mobility and case numbers to show that a reduction in mobility in the northeastern states didn't necessarily lead to an increase in mobility in the northeastern states didn't always lead to an increase in the number of COVID cases, right? Or a reduction in mobility in some of the very densely packed states didn't lead to a reduction in the number of COVID cases either. So
Mm.
attacking mobility as the number one criterion, right, for a country of 1.3 billion people was a very flawed policy. you know Maybe mobility shouldn't have been restricted, right? Maybe, at one point India shut down beaches and parks. Now we know that COVID is, not it's spreading more when you have people cooped up in a small interior space with the air conditioner running or something like that. And we should have opened beaches and we should have opened parks, and an increase in mobility outside the home wouldn't have necessarily led to an increase in the number of cases. But we followed a very bizarre policy. So, this one size fits all policy imposed massive costs across the country without a massive benefit in every region. There are very few
Yeah.
regions that benefited from the policy. And India corrected this later. The future lockdowns were not centralized and they were not one size fits all. So, on this particular question, I must say India learned very quickly from its mistakes. And, the future shelter in place requirements or lockdown requirements, they didn't quite do this.
Yeah, but there's a sort of an objective function question, right? So if the objective function is to sort of, dampen out the peaks, there's one policy. But what we're finding in COVID, especially long COVID, is that you have very severe long-term medical costs, CNS, central nervous system, cardiovascular issues. So if your objective function is to reduce societal costs due to this shock, then it's sort of a different policy, right? So, I know that Sweden had a very different way of approaching this. They seem to have done pretty well. But it would be a good case study to look at Sweden and say, if I don't know what the population of Sweden is, probably 6-7 million people, I'm guessing. If half of them had COVID at some point, there's a long-term cost issue for the country that hasn't been really analyzed, right? So, I mean, for India, there are two issues. One is if you look at the excess deaths in India from 2020 to 2022, we find like 6 or 7 million people.
Yeah.
And India reports only 500,000 or 600,000 people died
Yeah.
of COVID, which is completely incorrect, right? So we have had a massive, massive negative effect on utility on people. And so whatever policies India followed seem to have not worked, I would say.
Yes. So, there are two different and quite important points that you're making. Now, I agree with you about, there are some very long-term costs to society, especially if people get long COVID. Having said that, that was not the reason they imposed a centralized lockdown on
Yeah.
March 24th. And I think that does matter, right? If this was one of the reasons why this kind of lockdown was imposed, then I think we would have accounted for that a little bit differently in our analysis.
Mm.
Right. At that time, it was just a question of, oh, when people travel and we don't control it, and there are people coming from Italy and these conferences and students coming from China, and that's the reason COVID is spreading, and we need to clamp down on travel and mobility. Right. And that was the idea.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between traveling to the grocery store versus traveling internationally, right? There's a difference between even how you control grocery store travel. So, for instance, if you say, one of the COVID mandates, when they started slowly opening things up in some of the states, they said you can only go to the grocery store between, 5 and 7 in the evening. Now, that's a terrible COVID policy because
Mm.
it means everyone is going to crowd in 2 hours.
Yeah.
What you should instead say is that we're going to allow, for the first time, markets to be open 24 hours, so
Right.
that people don't densely pack around them, right? Now that can't be done at a countrywide level. That has to be a highly local municipal level mandate, right?
Mm.
For this particular market, which is a dense crowded market, these are the policies. For another market, which is an open mandi, with fresh air, but they're selling perishables, so it can only be for 4 hours in the morning, right? So I think we need to think about that question of local knowledge, local conditions differently. And I don't think long COVID featured anywhere, or like these huge costs on society featured anywhere in the original decision. So I would still criticize that, original lockdown decision based on the information at the time.
Yeah,
But
I
you're right.
agree.
On long COVID, I think you're right. But I don't think we still have very good answers
Yeah.
in terms of the long term cost to really do the cost benefit analysis. And then as an economist, that's really all I know how to do. On the second question of deaths, I think you've raised a really important point. Uh, we have dramatically underestimated deaths in India. Now, there are many reasons for that, but the reason once again goes back to a large extent to state capacity, which is the
Mm.
dysfunctional federalism argument. It's not that we have badly calculated COVID deaths. India has never been good at giving the correct cause of death before COVID either,
Mm.
right? So we don't have an accurate number of malaria deaths in India, or an accurate number of tuberculosis deaths in India. We are just simply bad at recording births and deaths. And we are furthermore very bad at recording cause of death, right? So this has just continued into COVID. And the reason I say this as a pointed thing is, a lot of people said, oh, the government is trying to hide the number of deaths, right? I mean, the government would have to be incredibly competent to systematically reach every hospital and every crematorium and make sure that they don't count deaths. I don't think that's what's happening. I think we're just bad at this. The second is, this is where like the perverse, incentives and the consequences start coming in. There were so many restrictions on how COVID deaths need to be treated when it comes to burials and cremations, right? There's the two main ways in which the last rites are done for the major religions in India. That a lot of the families were trying to hide that this is a COVID death, because otherwise the body would be taken away of their loved
Mm.
one and they won't be able to conduct last rites the way they want to,
Mm.
right? So there is a reason that hospitals were underreporting, because they simply didn't have the time and the manpower to go through the ICMR requirements of having that committee within each hospital to tag a COVID death or a non-COVID death. There was a lot of underreporting from families that go to the crematorium and then misreport because they don't want to be kicked out. Uh, and there is underreporting at a statistical level, because we're just not good at giving death certificates with cause of death.
Mm.
And when you put all of these factors together, you get a massive underestimate of COVID tag deaths. But we have become pretty good at estimating excess deaths. And as you said, the excess deaths, are in the range of 3 to 5 million, for the 2021 year. And they've like nothing to do with the actual deaths that have been tagged according to official statistics. Uh, Now, once again, when it comes to these deaths, when we start parsing through a lot of the newspaper stories and reporting on deaths, a lot of them are not because they got very severe COVID. A
Mm.
lot of it is because the hospital infrastructure was just crumbling and couldn't
Mm.
handle the number of cases and how quickly it exploded. And this is something Abhishek and I wrote the first version of our healthcare capacity paper. I think we published it on 4th of April, 2020, right? So this is as soon as COVID happens in India and the lockdown happens. And we're telling anyone who would listen that, look, healthcare capacity is not sufficient. Now, you can't magically increase the number of doctors, but you can very quickly increase the number of hospital beds and the number of ICU units and a number of oxygen tanks. This is a question of resource mobilization.
Mm.
Nobody listened to us, right? And now come to, April, May 2021, when the Delta wave hits. And in city after city, in hospital after hospital, the story that you hear is they ran out of oxygen. They ran out of hospital beds. There were people dying in the lobbies of hospitals. There were people dying on their way because there was no ambulance available. So they brought them in a private taxi, and the private taxi didn't have, the ambulance infrastructure to keep a person alive. This is a massive failure of governance.
Mm.
It is not because the disease was so complex and had, like, people got severe COVID or long COVID or comorbidities. These were avoidable deaths that should have been avoided. And I'm talking about sometimes simple policy. I had a conversation with Barkha, who's one of the most eminent journalists in India. She's written a wonderful book on COVID. It's called To Hell and Back, and I recently had a conversation with her on my podcast on this. uh, a green passage wasn't provided to ambulances in Delhi, during the Delta wave. In fact, to make sure that the lockdown was followed, you actually had the police blocking important roads. They had these barricades put, which slowed down traffic. And many people, including her father, and number of stories we've heard in Delhi, they died on the way to the hospital because they either couldn't get an appropriate, ambulance, or they died sitting in traffic.
Yeah.
Now, this is not even a COVID caused death, according to me. This is just like a government malfunction. So when Abhishek, Manish, and I are talking about state capacity, and we're talking about dysfunctional federalism, this is something we really need to pay attention to. We need to
Mm.
systematically look at which are the states and districts that don't have enough hospitals, that don't have enough doctors. How do we make sure we can give them the resources? So many places in Bihar we heard about where the primary healthcare center, they have machines, but they don't have electricity. So how are you going to run a ventilator? When a ventilator has been allotted, there's a nurse practitioner who can run it. But when you put the plug in,
Yeah.
nothing works because it doesn't get electricity. So these sorts of problems, I think, cannot be solved at a central or a union government level. They need a high level of mobilization for each state and each local government. And I think Indians really need to mobilize and say, we cannot die in this, there needs to be a dignity even in a pandemic, right? This,
Mm.
this is just shocking that people are dying waiting for a hospital bed. And I think that is something we need to have like a bigger social consciousness about.
Yeah, so I'm a bit conflicted about this, Shruti. So, I live in the southern state of Kerala. I don't live there, but my parents live there. Uh, and I lost my aunt and my niece to COVID
So sorry.
last last 6 months, last 9 months, I guess. And Kerala, many people say is pretty well advanced in terms of medicine and all of that, hospital beds, doctors, nurses. I mean, some of your charts show that Kerala has high levels of per capita doctors and nurses and hospital beds. But it's unclear to me that those aggregate metrics actually says anything, in the grand scheme of things. What do you think about that?
I agree with you. I think they tell you some bare basics, right? In terms of, hey, the number of beds you have is so disproportionate to the number of people and children and elderly you have, you got to make sure you do something about it. But on the other hand, just given that there are enough hospital beds doesn't mean that there will be always good healthcare that is provided at hand. And
Yeah.
there were a few things that happened in Kerala. Now, I have only heard this in terms of anecdotal evidence, but one of the things I've heard repeatedly is by the second year of the pandemic, there was just like institutional fatigue in Kerala
Mm.
because the number of cases were just not going down,
Yeah.
right? And even though the people are relatively rich and the hospital beds exist, you can't magically get more frontline workers. It takes 5 years to train a doctor, right? It takes 2, 3 years to train a nurse. So you can't quickly expand on certain margins, right? They're relatively inelastic.
But
And your nursing staff is basically exhausted by the time you reach end of 2021, because in Kerala the onslaught has been relentless, right?
yeah,
It's been there since February or March 2020.
yeah,
uh, this is a really, I fully appreciate what you're saying, that just having enough hospital beds or doctors is not sufficient. But we know what happens when even that doesn't exist,
yeah,
right? The silent deaths in Uttar Pradesh and the silent deaths in Bihar, and the mass burials, of people just being, in the shallow graves in the banks of the Ganges and things like that. So we know that that is true.
There were
right?
no options. There were no
There are no
options there.
options. Exactly. In Kerala, I still think, I mean, death is unfortunate and terrifying, and I'm so sorry for your loss, but it still feels like a story where there is dignity
Mm,
during the pandemic. There is a government response, there is a hospital response, there's a hospital to go to. Like the people who've lost their lives have lost them while getting medical treatment, and maybe
yeah,
it wasn't the level of care that anybody deserves. But something was available, right? They didn't die waiting for electricity to get turned on in a primary
sure.
healthcare center or
Yeah.
in an Uber in the middle of Delhi because there's a police barricade. And I think that's an important difference. Uh, the way I was in New Delhi, and the way people have spoken about the Delta wave. I grew up in a refugee colony in Delhi when I was younger, right? It felt very similar to how people spoke about the partition,
Mm,
in the sense that every single family has a tragedy, right? And it's not a minor level tragedy, it's a horror show, right? Every single one has a terrible story about what happened to their loved one and how there was no dignity or no way of getting closure or even grieving or mourning, the loss of a loved one. That I heard over and over again. I remember, I mean, this feels a little very minor, but I remember there was this one week in April 2021 when three very close friends, incidentally, all three of them lost their father.
mm.
And I heard about it. And I had to make, sort of three condolence calls back to back. And you would not believe this. The first question each one of them asked me was, hey, lots of people in Delhi. Do you have any contacts at the crematorium? We are on a 24-hour line. And that's just heartbreaking, right?
Mm.
You've called to console someone about the loss of their parent, and the first question they're asking each person is, do we have contacts at the crematorium? It just feels like a massive failure, of some sort. So this, I feel, is important because it has something to do with how we think about trauma as a society. It has something to do with how we think about expectations from the governance systems in society, right? The fact that we've survived this horror cannot mean that more horror is inflicted upon
Oh,
us.
it's coming. So I want to finish up with another paper that you have. So simple rules for the developing world. I really like this paper, Shruti. So much of the discussion you say in favor of simplicity of legal rules and against complex regulation is rooted in economically developed countries with strong state capacity. With economic development and state capacity comes the presumption that complex rules will be enforced. Therefore, analysis focuses on the administrative and error costs and the unintended consequences of complex rules that are enforced. Yeah, so I'm very much in favor of this, in favor of this idea. Um, so, I mean, personally, I want to eliminate income taxes and go to all the way to, sales taxes. You get high compliance. Income is a good, not a bad. So you shouldn't really tax income, but consumption should be taxed. In some way. But people say, well, the economy is driven by 63% consumption or whatever. But that's okay. I mean, things will change a little bit. Um, but the simplicity of regulation is quite important. So I just spent, I don't know, 3 weeks trying to do my taxes. And I have two graduate degrees. I can understand it. Um, So I don't know how 300 million people are doing their taxes. It is such a crazy thing to even think about. And so what are you saying here in terms of simplicity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that you like this paper. This is a very Chicago idea. This comes, the title of the paper comes from Richard Epstein's very famous book called, Simple Rules for a Complex World. And the idea is exactly as you say, which is as the economy becomes more and more complex, and as social interactions become more complex, does not necessarily imply that the regulatory environment needs to increase in complexity. In fact, the simpler the regulatory environment, the better it is for very high, degree of complexity or deep division of labor in society. And Richard Epstein talked about, contract law, tort law, property law. He had taxation. He had a bunch of areas that he talked about. Now, what I see, and this is, based on a lot of my work in India, that India has one of the most complex and cumbersome set of rules that exists anywhere in
Yeah.
the world, right? Now, the main difference between the United States and India that I see when, quite viscerally observe is if a rule is very complex in the United States, it is still enforced. And then people will complain about it. People will complain about how long it takes to do their taxes. Or entrepreneurs will complain about how long it takes to get a health permit from the city of, New York or whatever when they are setting up a
Yeah.
restaurant. In India, when rules become very complex, nobody follows them,
Right. You
right?
get
And
around them. You get
you
around
get
them.
around them. And the reason you get around them is twofold. One is the government simply does not have the capacity to enforce those rules. So if the government had the capacity to enforce the crazy rules, governing restaurants in Delhi, for instance, there is no way those rules would exist, because then people would really revolt. They would say, this is a crazy Kafka state. We can't run a restaurant business functionally. And if the government had that kind of state capacity, they would say, okay, we need to roll this back. What ends up happening in India instead is there is no state capacity to enforce these rules, right? So if you're talking about restaurant inspectors, right, you would, if a restaurant inspector actually shows up, it would be like maybe once in 5 years, because that's how many years it would take if he actually did his job carefully and properly. So instead, what he does is he kind of sends one of his minions once every 6 months and gets a big paycheck in terms of some kind of, corruption. Now, that's a terrible equilibrium that India is trapped in, right?
Mm.
So, Alex Tabrock and I, this paper is co authored with him. Our argument is that the Epsteinian insight, which is simple rules for a complex world, is even more important in countries which have poor state capacity than
Yeah.
countries which have high state capacity. Because when you have poor state capacity, your rules are not enforced equally, they're enforced arbitrarily, right? And because the rules are enforced arbitrarily and there's all this corruption, it leads to what we call like an endogenous increase in complex rules, right?
Mm.
So let's say a particular rule about, restaurant health certificates is not followed, right? And then someone dies, a child dies of food poisoning in a restaurant. What is the state response to this problem? It's not to increase the number of health inspectors or to allow the market to decide. It is anyone where there is a case of food poisoning in a restaurant will now have criminal penalty of 5 years, right? So you impose an even more complex rule. Now that is an even more difficult rule to enforce, so now you're further burdening your police capacity, your judicial capacity. So you're kind of trapped in this crazy circle. And our argument is the Epsteinian insight is way more important, right? In 70% of the world, or 70% of the world population, which is in developing countries with low state capacity, relative to the small percentage of people who are living in very prosperous states, where even the most complex tax regulation or the most complex restaurant regulation is going to be followed.
Yeah. So I agree with that, Shruti, but I think simplicity is always better. So US GAAP, for example, on the accounting side, is very complex. My understanding is the European equivalent is not that complex. So, for instance, suppose I write down a heuristic that says don't do anything bad. Okay, that's the only rule. Don't do anything bad. As opposed to this big US gap, if you do X, don't do X prime, and if you do X double prime, don't do X triple prime, and then we have thousands of lawyers getting around all those rules. That is a bad system. I mean, it doesn't really lead to anywhere, right? I mean, that is the fundamental issue here.
Yeah, and if you think this is a bad system for America, imagine how bad it is in a system that doesn't have anywhere close to American resources to enforce this or deal with it, right?
Yeah.
Even a terrible system in America, right? Even a very complex rule. Let's say you get sued by one of the regulatory agencies. You're still going to get your day in court, right?
Right.
In India, you're not going to get your day in court for 20 years. right? So
Right.
I think our argument is very much what you are saying, and then extending it to other parts of the world where this kind of law and economics analysis is simply not the mainstay, right? This has also got a lot to do with economics, the way it is. Development economists don't talk to law and economics people, right? These are like separate categories, right? Constitutional economists don't talk to healthcare economists, and that's why some of the work I'm doing you find both interesting and odd, right? The COVID and federalism paper is talking about a very important constitutional economics idea and
Yeah.
applying it to this particular case of a pandemic or healthcare capacity, right? And so similarly, here we're talking about what is an insight which is fairly well recognized now in law and economics, and we're extending the idea to development economics and developing countries. So I absolutely 100% agree with you that I don't think that these rules are anywhere close to ideal. I would like to go back to the Epsteinian version of these rules, right? But if you think these rules are bad here, and these rules are bad in the European Union, and these rules are bad in Australia, you don't even know how bad they are in Uganda, or how bad they are in Ethiopia, or how much damage they do in India, which is kind of the simple point, right?
Yeah. So
And sorry.
sorry. So the point you make here is that, like, in the case of India, yeah, I think you say here that it's a fairly sophisticated set of rules, let's say, but if you don't have any power to implement them, you just sort of complexify the process, right? So India, at least from afar, it appears to be one of those countries that that want to make rules and make it very. India is a very complex country, and it makes everything complex. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
And so from a regulatory perspective, it has a tendency, I would say, to complexify things, right? What you're arguing here is that if you don't have an enforcement mechanism, you don't have a standardization process, you don't have people understanding the rules that you make, that's probably not a good thing, right?
Actually, it's worse than not just being a good thing. It's
Yeah.
actively a terrible thing. Because what ends up happening is if there is very limited or weak state capacity and we add a lot of complexity to it, there's this phrase that Lant Pritchett and his co authors came up with called premature load bearing.
Hmm.
Okay. So what ends up happening when you have premature load bearing is, one way of thinking about it is, oh, if we overburden the system, maybe it gets strong and more robust. But in the case of complex rules, we've seen case study after case study that actually the system collapses.
Hmm.
So if you have a weak state or a state with relatively low level of state capacity and you increase complexity too soon,
Hmm.
what will end up happening is it will collapse under the burden of those complex rules, and it is never going to be able to develop the capacity that it needs to become prosperous, right? So it has a double impact. So the immediate impact is all your citizens and people engaged in every aspect of life are going through hell because it's too complicated to file their taxes, or it's too complicated to open a restaurant, or it's too complicated to get a marriage certificate or a driving license, right? But the worst part still is you are never going to get to a place where you can enforce rule of law because you have prematurely burdened your systems too much,
Hmm.
right? And now you get to a point where if your judicial capacity and your police capacity is overburdened with bad restaurant regulation because we've criminalized everything, you are going to spend less time investigating murders, right?
Hmm.
Or litigating or prosecuting murderers. And now you have a truly lawless society, right?
Hmm.
A society where people are not confident that a serious criminal is going to get prosecuted and actually see his day in court and be put behind bars. Then who cares about restaurant regulation anymore, right? So you're getting trapped in these strange short term, medium term, and long term equilibria, and they're very perverse. And the idea we try and show in this paper is there are no rich countries which have complex rules and weak state capacity,
Hmm.
right? In fact, there are virtually no rich countries which have complex rules and even high state capacity. most of the rich developed world actually has relatively, and I use the word relatively here, has relatively simple rules
Mm.
and relatively high state capacity. That is the winning combination to get out of the poverty trap in development economics, right? You want a strong state, you want a few rules that are enforced well, and then you want to leave everything else to, social transactions, market transactions, civil society.
And
Anything that gets in that way creates a problem.
and I think the other part you talk about here is sort of corruption. So when you have low state capacity and high complexity in rules, it sort of nourishes corruption, right? Is that a way to think about it?
Absolutely. So, multiple reasons. One is if you have complex rules that nobody thinks is going to be enforced, the classic example of these labor inspectors or these health inspectors, right? India had such a complicated labor law system, which has still not been reformed, and so few labor inspectors that I think we've quantified this somewhere in the paper, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But it's something like each labor inspector can only go to a factory once every 5 years or once every 10
Mm.
years or something. So that's not a functional labor inspection system. So what ends up happening? You start bribing your labor inspector because he has the ability to shut down your firm, right? We've given a lot of power to one guy. He can really shut down your operations temporarily or permanently. So to make sure that you kind of keep him at bay in a world of low state capacity, you give him bribes. But the other aspect of a weak state capacity system is it's not going to be very good at identifying and prosecuting the corrupt officer either.
Mm.
You have very few corrupt officers in the United States because rules are enforced. There are very few officers who are actually breaking the rules. They're easier to find, right?
Mm.
In India, if virtually all your labor inspectors are corrupt, it's going to be harder to find them, right? And if your judicial and your police capacity is overburdened by thousand other regulatory problems, then they're not going to have enough capacity to actually find these people and prosecute them. So you get into a different kind of equilibrium, right? Cascading. It has this cascading effect, uh, which is the reason that corruption becomes endemic. It becomes harder to resolve corruption. So the only way out of this equilibrium is to take away the pressure points where people can extract some kind of a bribe, right?
Mm.
And that point is either you dismantle your labor inspection system or you make it extremely simple, and so on and so forth. A simple example of what they did in the case of traffic cops in India, for instance, right? Earlier, a traffic cop would cut the challan. The challan is the traffic ticket, as they call it in Hindi. He would cut the challan when he catches you, in some kind of traffic infraction. So while he's writing the ticket, you can kind of go on the side and say, hey, why don't we resolve this privately? You give him a fraction of the ticket as the bribe. You escape the ticket. One of the rules that's been brought in is nobody is going to get a ticket on the spot. It's going to be mailed to you.
Mm.
Okay. Which basically means now there is a far, lesser opportunity to do this transaction on the spot and then avoid it. Right. Very often people don't even know that they've got a traffic ticket until it shows up in the mail.
Yeah.
Right. So this is an example of now your traffic cops are only dealing with traffic problems and crises on the spot, and the enforcement of minor and major traffic infractions, that is going to be done by a separate agency or a separate traffic court or tribunal when your ticket shows up at home. Now, I'm not saying we've completely removed, all graft in traffic violations. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying sometimes simplifying enforcement rules or taking away the power from a particular inspector or a
Yeah.
particular bureaucrat can actually have quite an important impact. Another interesting way of doing this is dramatically reducing the penalty for a traffic ticket, right?
Mm.
So if a traffic ticket only costs 100 rupees, right, most people don't want to pay bribes. Most people are good people, right? And there are very few cops who want to sell their soul for 20 rupees, right? So you're more likely to be corrupt if the amount that you can extract is high. You're more likely to pay the bribe if the actual penalty is so high that you're better off settling for the bribe. But
Mm.
if the penalties uniformly become lower in number, you're better off just paying the penalty on both sides,
Yeah.
right? And the cop is also better off accepting the penalty. So even if you don't want to do away with all the traffic rules, there are ways of simplifying the system, making it more incentive aligned, that the enforcement mechanism doesn't impose so heavily on state capacity.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Shruti. I know that you have to go. So thanks so much for spending time with me.
This was such a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time, so carefully to read the papers and to engage with this. I'm a big fan of the podcast and the show. And, it was just lovely to have this conversation with you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.